Afghanistan like to bat first.
This is the last look. It's almost as good as a Minecraft video. Imagine that.
Everyone in T20 cricket seems to like to bat second, or most people at least, except for those with Rashid Khan in their team. Afghanistan take their Rashid Khan angle a little bit further than some of his other teams. And they make you play 75% of the game with the fear of what Rashid Khan is eventually going to do to you. Holding him back to the 10 over mark of the second innings, kind of like what they used to do with monsters in old-timey Hollywood horror movies. And you can see why they do it. And it's something that has worked a lot for them. But interestingly enough, during this tournament, they decided to bat second as well. And I can only assume that's because this tournament suddenly became about everyone batting second. If you look at the games between the test-playing nations in round 2, 5 have been won by the team batting first. Is it 5 or 6? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5. If you look at the games between the test-playing nations in round 2 of this tournament, 5 have been won by the team batting first. And it's worth looking at the games where teams actually won when batting first. Like one is England-South Africa, where a very motivated South Africa team played in England who just needed to not get bowled out for under 100. So that's a hard one to get your head around. The Bangladesh-West Indies game came down to the wire, so at best that was a coin toss by the end. Afghanistan flipped their own script when they realised that a great plan against teams as good as them or worse wouldn't quite work against the top sides. And so they bowled first, but they never really got anywhere near India. England beat Sri Lanka because of a Joss Buttler special, but Sri Lanka held on for a while in that match. And the West Indies lost to Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka put in a good first innings and only 2 West Indian batters made double figures. If a third had, maybe they'd have got closer or maybe even stolen the game. And that's it. I don't really have that much else to talk about because it didn't happen very often. But let's look at some of the wins when teams were batting second. Australia beat South Africa, who collapsed in the middle overs. England beat the West Indies next, who collapsed all the way through for 55 runs. So that's the first 2 games. I don't think you can really blame anything other than shit batting or good bowling for those 2. India lost to Pakistan after their top order lost its head. Now Jude did play a role here, but India were already well behind by then. West Indies lost to South Africa in the Lendl Simmons go slow match. They lost wickets and they just didn't make enough runs. New Zealand kept losing regular wickets to Pakistan, or Haris Rauf at least, and their 134 was just never going to be enough, no matter where they batted. Bangladesh dribbled to 124 against England. They were realistically never in that game. Sri Lanka got 154 against Australia, who then won with 3 overs to spare. Australia, however, made no runs against England. India did the exact same thing against New Zealand. Bangladesh didn't cross 100 against South Africa or Australia, and to be fair, they had pretty much checked out of the tournament by that point. West Indies-Australia was more like a beer match in the end, more about Chris Gale's retirement and Dwayne Bravo's retirement. But the easy chase that Australia had, again, came from West Indies losing so many early wickets. And Afghanistan lost too many wickets against New Zealand to put up a really good score. So I just went through quite a few games there, and in all of them, the team batting second won. But how many of those games were because of conditions? I think dew probably played a role in some of them. But in almost every case, the team batting first just didn't make any runs. The bowlers were either on top or the batters just didn't play very well. And there's nothing in UAE conditions that make people score 55, 84, 85, or 110. Even the few 120 scores were usually down to poor batting much more than the pitch. And few of these teams were even in the game when the dew came in. Not to mention that not all the games were day-nighters anyway. But there are a couple of games where the second innings advantage, I think, did play a role. Bangladesh losing to Sri Lanka. This is a kind of second innings win that you see a lot of. I think Bangladesh got a bit lost in their matchups and they didn't seem to have done much research on the Sri Lankan middle order, but I think it certainly helped Sri Lanka that they were chasing in that game. Afghanistan had Pakistan worried, but Asif Ali finished it easy enough. That's a sort of finish to an innings that can happen in a low chase with wickets in hand. Sri Lanka should have beaten South Africa, but that was a proper coin flip at the end. But it did go the way of South Africa. And if you wanted to, you could put the India-Pakistan game in here. But I think it was clear on that surface that India lost too many early wickets, got behind in the game, and they had taken no wickets, even when the dew came in. If you take out the comically one-sided games, which almost all seem to occur to teams batting first, it looks more like a 50-50 split again. Was it an advantage to bat second? Yes. Does that account for 5 out of 23 wins for the team up first? Put it this way, if you tossed a coin 23 times, you might get a similar result. But you wouldn't think, oh, this coin is rigged, unless, someone dodgy had brought the coin to you. You'd probably just think, well, that's a random thing that has happened. So I thought we should look a little bit more into batting first and batting second in T20 games. Of the last 1,416 T20 internationals, which have occurred in the last 5 years, more have been won by teams batting first than second. Although it's basically 50-50 split. Now, international T20s are not that reliable, which is why I quite often don't use them for data, although that is a lot of games. But there is now a lot of weaker teams. For instance, that includes 86 international teams. And there would be some stunning mismatches in that. So I asked my friend Amol Desai to look up the domestic stats, as leagues are far more even. And he found that 49% of teams win when they bat first, which is again, really close to 50-50. And 38% of the time, teams choose to bat first. And he looked at first batter wins versus, and he had a bit of a deeper look, looking at the teams who win first and bat, and also the teams who win first and choose to bat. And when I first saw this, I did think maybe we were onto something, because there are 3 Asian teams towards the bottom half of this. But Bangladesh and UAE are nowhere near them. And the UAE actually comes off looking pretty normal. He also looked at winning the toss and batting first. And the one country where they seemed to have the most effect was the UAE. It was the only one above 50%. In fact, let me read something to you from him. India, UAE, and West Indies are the only 3 places where the toss matters the most either way. Teams winning the toss win more with that decision than the baseline. And UAE is the one where there is the most lift. India and West Indies may not even be significant statistically. So you win the toss and bat in the UAE. In fact, you should just try and win the toss in the UAE. If you win the toss and bat first, you win 55% of the time. And if you win the toss and you choose to bat second, it's 58% of the time. So being that most teams have chosen to bat second, that 58% actually holds up kind of well in this tournament. Of the test playing nation matches, the winners of the toss won 65%, which is big, but not that much bigger than normal. But big enough to notice. It was just made more obvious by the fact that of the 23 top tier nation games, only 3 times did someone actually choose to bat first. That was impossible to miss if you were watching this tournament. And when you just look back at the results, it is hard to say the toss and batting second didn't have a massive impact. But diving deeper game by game as I did, I actually felt less sure about this. And I was the guy who said when he was asked who would win this tournament, I don't know, whichever team wins the toss in the semi-final and the final. But the more I looked at these stats, the more I realized that maybe it was just a little bit more random than we thought. For instance, Dew just couldn't have affected so many of these games because they were kind of over well before then. That's not to say that the toss and Dew hasn't been a factor, it just hasn't been maybe the factor that the numbers have made it look like. But if everyone who was watching this tournament continues to moan about the Dew the same way they have, maybe cricket will actually start to look at ways to counter that aren't a grown man just sticking a towel down his back passage. But look at these numbers. The one thing I learned going in, and I still kind of know, is that this tournament is just far too small a sample size to really know anything. Which is why Amol and I were looking at a 5-year period and a 1,400 game samples as minimum. But if you're still fully locked into this toss and batting second thing, I can get that. You watch this tournament, you have your own biases and eyes, and Australia have won the toss on 5 occasions for 5 wins. Pakistan won it on 4 occasions for 4 wins. And the only time they batted second, and their other win was when they batted second against Afghanistan because Afghanistan sent them in. However, England won the toss 3 times and had 2 wins and a loss. Whether we count that South African loss, I don't know. And New Zealand have only won the toss twice in the tournament, although they were one of the few teams that actually did get to bat second because of Afghanistan. And if you're looking for certainty from this video after everything I've now done and maybe a little bit more confusion that I've brought out, let me say this. I am positive that New Zealand will be playing Australia in the final of this World Cup.